The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers for the third time, clattering against the concrete floor of our garage. I cursed under my breath, wiping my hands on an old rag that had seen better days. The Ford's engine block stared back at me like a metal puzzle I couldn't solve, much like everything else in my life lately. "Danny, I'm heading out for yoga," Sophie called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd developed over the past few months, distant, almost relieved to be leaving. I crawled out from under the hood, my knees protesting against the cold concrete. Through the open garage door, I could see her loading her gym bag into her silver BMW, the one she'd insisted we needed for her professional image at the law firm. At 42, I was still driving a truck older than some of my coworkers' kids, but Sophie needed to look successful. "Have fun," I called back, though she was already backing out of the driveway. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual. I'd been married to Sophie for 15 years, and somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being a team and started being roommates who occasionally shared the same bed. She blamed it on stress from her job at Morrison and Associates, the biggest law firm in our Rust Belt town of Millfield. I blamed it on the fact that she'd become someone I barely recognized. I picked up the wrench again, focusing on the familiar weight of it in my hands. Working with tools had always been my escape. While Sophie dealt with contracts and corporate disputes, I fixed things: air conditioning units, heating systems, the occasional plumbing emergency. It was honest work that left me tired but satisfied at the end of each day. The sound of my phone buzzing against the workbench interrupted my thoughts. A text from my neighbor, Mrs. Harker, who lived across the street and seemed to have a supernatural ability to know everyone's business before they did. "Danny, saw Sophie leaving. Thought she had yoga on Thursdays?" I frowned, wiping my hands again before typing back. "She does. Why?" "Nothing. Just thought I saw her car at that new wellness center on Pine Street yesterday during her usual yoga time. Must have been someone else's BMW." Mrs. Harker was 73 and had lived on Maple Street longer than anyone could remember. She wasn't malicious, just observant in the way that retired people with too much time on their hands tended to be, but her comments stuck with me as I returned to the engine. Sophie had been going to yoga 3 times a week for the past 6 months, ever since she joined the executive wellness program at some fancy studio downtown. She'd come home glowing and energized, talking about how the exercise helped her deal with the stress of her caseload. I'd been happy for her, glad she'd found something that seemed to bring back some of the spark that had been missing. But Pine Street was nowhere near her usual studio. I tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the carburetor that had been giving me trouble. The Ford was a 1998 F-150 with over 200,000 miles on it, but it was mine, and I understood every bolt and gasket. Unlike my marriage, I knew how to fix what was wrong with it. An hour later, I was washing my hands in the kitchen sink when I heard Sophie's car in the driveway. She came through the door looking refreshed, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly damp with sweat. "Good workout?" I asked, drying my hands on a dish towel. "Amazing," she said, dropping her gym bag by the door. "We did this new routine that really targets the core muscles. I can already feel it working." She moved to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of water, drinking deeply. I watched her, noting the way she avoided eye contact, how she seemed almost too casual in her movements. "Mrs. Harker mentioned seeing your car on Pine Street yesterday," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Thought maybe you'd tried a different studio?" Sophie's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the water bottle. "Pine Street? No, I was definitely at the usual place. You know how Mrs. Harker is. She probably saw someone else's BMW and thought it was mine. Half the lawyers in town drive the same car." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "I'm going to grab a shower. What do you want to do for dinner?" "Whatever you're in the mood for," I replied, but she was already heading upstairs. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the sound of water running through the pipes. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Sophie had always been a terrible liar. It was one of the things I'd loved about her when we first met. She wore her emotions on her face, couldn't keep secrets to save her life. But the woman who just walked through our kitchen had looked me straight in the eye and lied about where she'd been yesterday. I was sure of it. The next morning, I was loading my tools into the truck when I noticed Sophie's gym bag still sitting by the front door. She'd left for work early, as she'd been doing more and more lately, claiming she needed to get a head start on her cases. I glanced around, making sure no one was watching, then unzipped the bag. Inside were the usual things: yoga mat, water bottle, a change of clothes. But at the bottom, wrapped in a small towel, was something that made my stomach drop: a hotel keycard from the Millfield Inn. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. The Millfield Inn wasn't exactly a 5-star establishment. It was the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour as much as by the night, located on the outskirts of town near the old industrial district. It wasn't somewhere Sophie would go for any legitimate reason. I rewrapped the keycard and put everything back exactly as I'd found it, my hands shaking slightly. There had to be an explanation. Maybe she was working on a case that involved the hotel. Maybe she was meeting a client there for some reason. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew I was grasping at straws. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went through the motions of my job, fixing a broken air conditioning unit at the elementary school, replacing a water heater for an elderly couple on the south side of town, but my mind kept returning to that key card. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision. I needed to know what was going on, and the only way to find out was to follow Sophie to her next yoga session. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables for what looked like a stir-fry. She smiled when she saw me, the same warm smile that had made me fall in love with her all those years ago. How was your day?" she asked, leaning over to kiss my cheek. "Fine," I said, studying her face for any sign of deception. "Yours?" "Busy. Morrison has me working on this new corporate merger that's incredibly complex. I might have to work late a few nights this week." "What about yoga?" "Oh, I'll still make time for that. It's the only thing keeping me sane right now." She turned back to the vegetables, but not before I caught something in her expression, a flicker of excitement that seemed out of place for someone complaining about work stress. "When's your next class?" I asked casually. "Tomorrow night, 7:30, like always." I nodded, already planning my route to the wellness center. If Sophie was really going to yoga, I'd see her car in the parking lot and could put my suspicions to rest. If she wasn't, well, I'd deal with that when the time came. The next evening, I told Sophie I was meeting my buddy Frank at Murphy's bar to watch the game. It wasn't entirely a lie. Frank would be there, and there was a game on, but I had no intention of staying for more than one beer. I left the house at 7, giving myself enough time to position myself across from the wellness center before Sophie's supposed class started. The parking lot was well lit, and I had a clear view of the entrance from where I sat in my truck. At 7:20, I saw Sophie's BMW pull into the lot. She parked near the back, away from the main entrance, and sat in her car for several minutes. I could see her checking her phone, and even from a distance, she seemed nervous, excited. Then, at exactly 7:30, she got out of her car and walked not toward the wellness center, but toward a dark blue sedan parked 2 spots away. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even in the dim light, I could see he was tall, well-built, probably in his late 30s. He was wearing expensive clothes, the kind of casual outfit that cost more than I made in a week. Sophie walked straight into his arms, and they kissed with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I sat frozen in my truck, watching my wife of 15 years embrace another man in a parking lot while she was supposed to be in yoga class. The rationale part of my brain told me to start the engine and drive away, to process what I'd seen before, doing something I'd regret. But I couldn't move. They talked for a few minutes, their body language intimate and familiar. This wasn't a first meeting or a casual encounter. This was a relationship, something that had been going on for a while. Then they got into his car and drove away. I followed at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. They drove through downtown Millfield, past the courthouse where Sophie worked, past the diner where we'd had our first date, and out toward the industrial district. They pulled into the parking lot of the Millfield Inn. I parked across the street behind the abandoned gas station and watched as they walked into the lobby together, Sophie's hand in his. They moved like a couple, comfortable and confident. The man put his arm around her waist as they approached the front desk, and Sophie laughed at something he said. I sat there for 2 hours, watching the windows of the second floor, wondering which room they were in and what they were doing. The not knowing was almost worse than the knowing. At 10:15, they emerged from the lobby. Sophie looked disheveled but happy, her hair messed up and her clothes wrinkled. They kissed again by his car, a long, passionate goodbye that told me everything I needed to know about the nature of their relationship. I followed Sophie home, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice my headlights. She pulled into our driveway at 10:45, 15 minutes before her yoga class was supposed to end. By the time she walked through the front door, I was sitting on the couch with a beer, pretending to watch television. "How was yoga?" I asked without looking up. "Great," she said, dropping her gym bag by the door. "We worked on balance tonight. I'm exhausted." She headed upstairs for her shower, the same routine as always. I listened to the water running and tried to process what I'd witnessed. My wife was having an affair, not just a momentary lapse in judgment or an emotional connection that had gotten out of hand, but a full-blown, ongoing affair complete with hotel rooms and elaborate lies. The next few days passed in a strange haze of normalcy, Sophie went to work, came home, made dinner, and pretended everything was fine. I went through the motions of our usual routine, but inside, I was planning my next move. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way Sophie checked her phone constantly, always keeping it face down on the table, how she'd started taking longer showers and paying more attention to her appearance. The new lingerie I'd assumed she'd bought for my benefit, but which I now realized I'd never seen her wear around me. On Thursday, while Sophie was at work, I decided to do some detective work of my own. I'd never been the type to snoop through my wife's belongings, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I started with her dresser, looking for anything that might give me more information about her affair. In the back of her jewelry box, hidden behind a stack of earrings she never wore, I found a small key. It took me a few minutes to figure out what it unlocked, but eventually, I discovered it opened a small lockbox hidden in the back of her closet, behind a stack of old law school textbooks. Inside the box was a second cell phone. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding. This was it, the smoking gun that would either confirm my suspicions or prove me wrong. With shaking hands, I powered it on. The phone was full of text messages, photos, and call logs that painted a picture of a double life I never could have imagined. The contact list was small, but each name told a story that made me feel sick. Eric was the man I'd seen her with at the hotel. The messages between them were explicit, detailing not just their physical relationship, but also their emotional connection. But Eric wasn't the only name in the phone. There was Michael, David, and James, all married men. Based on the content of their conversations, Sophie wasn't just having an affair, she was having multiple affairs, all at the same time. As I scrolled through the messages, a pattern emerged that was even more disturbing than the infidelity itself. Sophie wasn't just attracted to these men, she was specifically attracted to the fact that they were married. The messages were full of references to the thrill of secrecy, the excitement of stealing someone else's husband, the rush of knowing she was breaking up families. One message to Eric made my blood run cold. I love that you're married. It makes everything so much more exciting. Your wife has no idea what she's missing, and I have no intention of letting her find out. You're my little secret, and I'm never giving you back. Another to someone named David. Met your wife at the grocery store today. She seems nice. Too bad she doesn't know her husband is thinking about me when he's in bed with her. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of my wife's betrayal, and tried to understand how I'd missed the signs. How had the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd built a life with, become someone capable of this level of deception and cruelty? But as I continued reading, I realized that Sophie hadn't just hidden her affairs from me. She'd hidden her true nature. The messages revealed someone who took pleasure in causing pain, who saw other people's marriages as games to be won rather than relationships to be respected. I was still sitting there when I heard her car in the driveway. I had just enough time to put everything back exactly as I'd found it and compose myself before Sophie walked through the door. She called out a greeting as she dropped her purse and keys on the kitchen counter, the same routine as always. "How was your day?" she asked, appearing in the living room doorway with that bright smile that now seemed like a mask. "Fine," I managed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Yours?" "Long. Morrison's got me working on 3 different cases now. I barely had time for lunch." She moved to the couch and sat down beside me, curling up against my side in a gesture that would have been comforting just days ago. Now it felt like a lie, another performance in the elaborate play she'd been staging for months. "I was thinking," she said, tracing patterns on my chest with her finger, "maybe we should plan a vacation. We haven't been anywhere together in ages." The casual way she suggested it, as if she wasn't secretly planning hotel visits with multiple married men, made me want to scream. Instead, I nodded and made some non-committal response about checking our schedules. That night, I lay awake listening to Sophie sleep beside me, her breathing deep and peaceful. How could she sleep so soundly when she was living such an elaborate lie? How could she touch me, kiss me, make plans for our future when she was actively working to destroy other families? I thought about confronting her directly, laying out everything I'd discovered and demanding an explanation. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the growing anger that was building in my chest like pressure in a boiler. Sophie had made me look like a fool for months, and I wasn't ready to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much she'd hurt me. Instead, I decided I needed more information. If I was going to confront her, I wanted to understand the full scope of her betrayal. The next day, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. After Sophie left for the office, I drove to the Millfield Inn and asked to speak with the manager. "I'm trying to track down some charges on my wife's credit card," I lied, showing him Sophie's photo on my phone. She's been staying here for work, but the dates don't match up with her travel schedule. The manager, a tired-looking man in his 50s, studied the photo and nodded. Oh yeah, I know her. She's been coming in pretty regularly for the past few months, always with the same guy, tall, dark hair, drives a blue sedan. How regularly? Once, maybe twice a week. They always book the same room, always pay cash, seemed like a nice couple. My stomach turned at the word couple, but I kept my expression neutral. Do you happen to know the man's name? The manager shook his head. She always handles the registration. Goes by Mrs. Johnson, but I figured that wasn't her real name. Most of our regulars don't use their real names, if you know what I mean. I thanked him and left, my mind racing. Once or twice a week for months, this wasn't a casual fling or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a sustained relationship, something Sophie had been nurturing and maintaining while lying to my face every single day. I spent the rest of the morning driving around Millfield, trying to process what I'd learned. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision. I needed to know who Eric was, and I needed to know if his wife knew what was happening. That evening, I waited until Sophie was in the shower, then quickly accessed her secret phone again. I found Eric's full contact information in their message history, Eric Morrison, with an address on the wealthy side of town. Morrison, the same last name as Sophie's law firm. I did a quick internet search and found Eric's social media profiles. He was 38, worked in commercial real estate, and was married to a woman named Maggie. Their Facebook pages were full of photos from family vacations, anniversary dinners, and holiday celebrations. They looked happy, completely unaware that Eric was living a double life. But as I scrolled through Maggie Morrison's recent posts, I noticed something that made me pause. Her updates had become less frequent over the past few months, and when she did post, there was a forced quality to her cheerfulness that reminded me of my own recent attempts to maintain normalcy. On impulse, I created a fake email account and sent Maggie a message. I have information about your husband that you need to know. If you want to learn the truth, meet me at Murphy's Bar tomorrow at 6 p.m. I'll be wearing a blue baseball cap. I hit send before I could change my mind. The next day crawled by at an agonizing pace. I went through the motions of work, fixing a broken furnace at the local bank and replacing some faulty wiring at a small office building. But my mind was focused on the evening ahead. At 5:30, I drove to Murphy's Bar, a local establishment that had been serving Millfield's working class for over 40 years. It wasn't the kind of place Sophie or her law firm colleagues would frequent, which made it perfect for a clandestine meeting. I ordered a beer and found a table near the back, my blue baseball cap clearly visible. At exactly 6 o'clock, a woman walked through the door and looked around uncertainly. She was petite, with short blonde hair and tired eyes that seemed to be searching for something she was afraid to find. "Maggie?" I called softly. She approached my table cautiously, clutching her purse like a shield. "You're the one who sent the email?" I nodded and gestured for her to sit down. "My name is Danny. I think our spouses are having an affair." The words hung in the air between us like a bomb waiting to explode. Maggie's face went pale, but she didn't seem surprised, just defeated, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "I just found out a few days ago. You?" "I've suspected for about a month. Eric's been working late more often, taking mysterious phone calls, paying more attention to his appearance." She laughed bitterly. "All the classic signs, right? I've been hoping I was just being paranoid." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken of Sophie and Eric at the hotel parking lot. Maggie stared at them for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly. "That's definitely Eric," she said finally, "and that must be your wife. Sophie. They've been meeting at the Millfield Inn once or twice a week for months." Maggie closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "We've been married for 12 years. We have 2 kids, a 10-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. I thought we were happy." The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, and I felt a surge of anger towards Sophie and Eric for the casual way they were destroying innocent lives. "There's something else," I said gently. "Sophie isn't just having an affair with Eric. She's involved with multiple married men. It seems to be a pattern for her." Maggie's eyes snapped open. "Multiple men?" I nodded and explained what I'd found on Sophie's secret phone. As I talked, Maggie's expression shifted from hurt to anger to something harder and more determined. "She's collecting married men like trophies," Maggie said when I finished, "and my husband is just one of them. It looks that way." We sat in silence for a moment, 2 people whose lives had been shattered by the selfishness of others. Then Maggie looked up at me with a new resolve in her eyes. "What are we going to do about it?" The question hung between us, loaded with possibility and danger. I thought about Sophie's casual cruelty, her excitement at destroying other families, her complete lack of remorse for the pain she was causing. "I don't know yet," I said, "but they can't be allowed to keep doing this to people." Maggie nodded slowly. "Eric thinks he's so smart, so careful. He has no idea that I've been watching him, documenting his lies. I've been building a case against him without even realizing it." "What kind of case?" "Photos, credit card statements, phone records. I'm a paralegal. I know how to gather evidence. I just wasn't sure what I was going to do with it." An idea began to form in my mind, something that would give Sophie and Eric exactly what they deserved while protecting the innocent people they were hurting. "What if we worked together?" I suggested. "What if we made sure they faced the consequences of their actions in a way they'd never forget?" Maggie's smile was sharp and determined. "I think that's exactly what we should do." Over the next 2 weeks, Maggie and I met 3 more times at Murphy's bar, each time sharing new evidence and refining our plan. What had started as a desperate need for answers had evolved into something more calculated and purposeful. Maggie proved to be an invaluable ally. Her background as a paralegal had given her skills I never would have thought to use, and her anger at Eric's betrayal matched my own fury at Sophie's deception. Together, we built a comprehensive picture of our spouse's affair that would have impressed any private investigator. "Look at this," Maggie said during our 3rd meeting, sliding a manila folder across the table. Eric's credit card statements for the past 4 months, hotel charges, expensive restaurant bills, jewelry purchases that I never received. I flipped through the statements, noting the dates and amounts. These match up perfectly with Sophie's yoga schedule. And look at this jewelry charge. $200 at Brennan's Fine Jewelry on the same day Sophie came home with a new necklace she claimed was a gift from her boss. "Your wife is expensive," Maggie observed dryly. "Eric's spending almost $1,000 a month on their little romance." I thought about our family budget, how Sophie had been complaining about money lately, suggesting we cut back on expenses while she was secretly accepting expensive gifts from her lover. The hypocrisy was staggering. I've been tracking her movements too," I said, pulling out a small notebook where I'd been recording Sophie's activities. "She's not just seeing Eric. Last Tuesday, she had lunch with someone named David at the Riverside Cafe. Yesterday, she met someone called James at a hotel downtown. She's juggling at least 3 different affairs." Maggie shook her head in amazement. "How does she keep track of all the lies?" "Practice, I guess. She's been doing this for longer than we thought." I'd been doing more research into Sophie's past, reaching out to old friends and acquaintances under the guise of planning a surprise party. What I'd learned had been disturbing. Sophie's pattern of pursuing married men went back years, possibly to before our own marriage. I'd been living with a stranger who had been playing an elaborate long game from the very beginning. "So, what's our next move?" Maggie asked. I'd been thinking about that question for days. Simple confrontation wouldn't be enough. Sophie and Eric would just deny everything, promise to change, and then become more careful about hiding their activities. They needed to face real consequences, the kind that would make them understand the pain they'd been inflicting on others. "I think it's time to arrange a meeting," I said, "but not the kind they're expecting." The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would invite Maggie to dinner at Giuseppe's, the nicest Italian restaurant in Millfield, on a night when Sophie was supposed to be at yoga. I'd tell Sophie I was having dinner with a potential client, something that wouldn't raise any suspicions. Then, just as Maggie and I were settling in for our meal, I'd text Sophie that my client had canceled and suggest she join me for a romantic dinner. When she arrived, she'd find me sitting across from Eric's wife, and we'd see how well her talent for deception served her in an unexpected situation. "What if she doesn't come?" Maggie asked. "She will. Sophie loves making grand gestures when she thinks she has the moral high ground. If she thinks I'm having dinner alone after being stood up by a client, she'll rush over to support me. It'll make her feel good about herself." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. We set the plan in motion for the following Thursday. I made reservations at Giuseppe's for 7:30, choosing a table in the center of the dining room where we'd be clearly visible to anyone entering the restaurant. That morning, Sophie mentioned she had yoga that evening, followed by drinks with some of her colleagues. She'd probably be home late, she said, kissing me goodbye with the same casual affection she'd been displaying for months. "Have fun," I replied, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. At 7:15, I was sitting across from Maggie at Giuseppe's, both of us dressed nicely but not formally. To any observer, we looked like a couple on a dinner date, which was exactly the impression we wanted to create when Sophie arrived. "You nervous?" Maggie asked, adjusting the napkin in her lap. "Terrified," I admitted, "but also excited. Sophie's been controlling the narrative for months, making me feel crazy for suspecting what was right in front of my face. Tonight, she loses that control." At 7:30, I sent the text, Client canceled last minute. Want to join me for dinner? I'm at Giuseppe's, table 12. Sophie's response came within minutes. Poor baby, on my way. Maggie and I ordered wine and appetizers, making small talk while we waited. Despite the circumstances that had brought us together, I found myself genuinely enjoying her company. She was intelligent, funny, and had a dry sense of humor that reminded me of who I used to be before Sophie's lies had made me question everything. There she is, Maggie said softly, nodding toward the entrance. I turned to see Sophie scanning the dining room, looking for my table. She was dressed in her yoga clothes, but had clearly stopped somewhere to freshen up. Her makeup was perfect, and she'd styled her hair. When she spotted me, her face lit up with what appeared to be genuine concern and affection. She started walking toward our table, her expression warm and loving. Then she noticed Maggie sitting across from me, and her steps faltered slightly. I could see the confusion on her face as she tried to process what she was seeing. Sophie approached our table with a forced smile, her eyes darting between Maggie and me as she tried to understand the situation. Hi, honey, she said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. I thought your client canceled. He did, I replied calmly. Sophie, I'd like you to meet Maggie Morrison. Maggie, this is my wife, Sophie. The color drained from Sophie's face as she heard the last name, but she recovered quickly, extending her hand to Maggie with practiced politeness. Nice to meet you, Sophie said, though her voice was slightly strained. Morrison, are you related to someone at the law firm? In a way, Maggie replied, shaking Sophie's hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm married to Eric Morrison. You know Eric, don't you, Sophie? The silence that followed was electric. Sophie's hand froze in mid-shake, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to figure out how much Maggie knew and how much danger she was in. Eric Morrison, Sophie repeated slowly. I don't think I know anyone by that name. Really? I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling to the photos I'd taken in the hotel parking lot. Because you two seemed pretty friendly when I saw you together last week. I turned the phone so Sophie could see the screen. The image was clear and unmistakable, Sophie and Eric embracing in the parking lot of the Millfield Inn, their body language leaving no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Sophie stared at the photo for a long moment, her face cycling through a range of emotions, shock, fear, anger, and finally, a kind of desperate calculation. I can explain, she said finally. Please do, Maggie said, her voice deadly calm. I'd love to hear your explanation for why you've been sleeping with my husband for the past 6 months. The restaurant around us seemed to fade into background noise as Sophie stood frozen beside our table, caught between two people who knew exactly what she'd been doing. I could see her mind working frantically, trying to find an angle, a story that might salvage the situation. This isn't what it looks like, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Really? I replied, keeping my tone conversational despite the rage building in my chest. Because it looks like you've been having an affair with Eric Morrison while telling me you were at yoga classes. It looks like you've been lying to my face for months while you destroyed this woman's marriage. Sophie glanced around the restaurant, clearly aware that other diners were beginning to notice the tension at our table. Giuseppe's was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and I could see the recognition dawning on several familiar faces as they realized what was happening. Can we please discuss this at home? Sophie asked, her voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. No, Maggie said firmly, standing up from her chair. We're going to discuss this right here, right now. I want to know how long you've been sleeping with my husband, and I want to know if you have any idea what you've done to my family. Sophie's composure finally cracked. Look, I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Eric and I just connected, and things happened naturally. It wasn't planned. Naturally? I pulled out Sophie's secret phone, which I'd retrieved from its hiding place before leaving the house. Is that what you call this? I scrolled to one of her messages to Eric and read it aloud. I love that you're married. It makes everything so much more exciting. Your wife has no idea what she's missing, and I have no intention of letting her find out. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Several nearby tables had gone completely silent, their occupants no longer even pretending not to listen to our conversation. Sophie's face went white. Where did you get that? From your secret phone, the one you've been using to coordinate your affairs with multiple married men. I scrolled to another message, this one to someone named David. Here's another one. Met your wife at the grocery store today. She seems nice. Too bad she doesn't know her husband is thinking about me when he's in bed with her. Maggie made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. You're collecting them, aren't you? Married men are like trophies to you. It's not like that, Sophie protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Then what is it like? I demanded, standing up from my chair. Explain to me how you justify destroying families for fun. Explain to me how you sleep next to me every night after spending the afternoon in a hotel room with someone else's husband. Sophie looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. The entire restaurant was watching now, and I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized there was no way to spin this situation in her favor. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising slightly. My marriage to you has been dead for years. We're like roommates, Danny. Eric makes me feel alive again. So get a divorce, Maggie snapped. Don't destroy my marriage because yours isn't working. And what about David and James and whoever else you're seeing? I added. Are all of their marriages dead too, or do you just enjoy the thrill of taking what doesn't belong to you? Sophie's mask finally slipped completely, and I saw something ugly and defiant flash in her eyes. You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I love the excitement of being with married men. Yes, I love knowing that I can take someone away from their boring suburban wives whenever I want. And yes, I love the fact that you've all been too stupid to figure it out. The honesty was shocking in its cruelty. This wasn't the woman I'd married, or maybe it was, and I'd just been too blind to see her true nature. Sophie, I said quietly, you're sick. I'm alive, she shot back. I'm living my life instead of settling for some pathetic existence in this dead-end town with a man who fixes air conditioners for a living. The insult hit harder than I'd expected, but it also crystallized something for me. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about Sophie's complete lack of respect for me, for our marriage, for anyone who didn't serve her immediate desires. You're right about one thing, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket. Our marriage is dead. I pulled out a manila envelope and placed it on the table in front of her. Divorce papers. I had them drawn up yesterday. Sophie stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. Danny, wait. We can work this out. We can go to counseling, figure out how to fix things. Fix things? Maggie laughed bitterly. You just told us you love destroying marriages. What exactly is there to fix? I was angry. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Yes, you did, I said, and that's why this marriage is over. I turned to address the restaurant, raising my voice so everyone could hear. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. My wife has been having affairs with multiple married men in our community, and I thought you should know in case any of your husbands have been acting strangely lately. The reaction was immediate and devastating. I could see recognition dawning on several faces as women began putting pieces together, remembering their husbands' unexplained absences and suspicious behavior. Sophie looked around the restaurant in horror as she realized the full scope of what was happening. Her reputation, her career, her entire social standing in Millfield was crumbling in real time. You can't do this, she whispered. I already did, I replied, and Maggie has some things she'd like to share about Eric. Maggie stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. Eric Morrison has been having an affair with this woman for months, spending thousands of dollars on hotel rooms and gifts while lying to me and our children. If anyone here has had business dealings with him, you might want to reconsider his trustworthiness. The damage was complete and irreversible. In the span of 10 minutes, Sophie and Eric's secret had become public knowledge in a way that would follow them for years. Sophie grabbed the divorce papers from the table and clutched them to her chest. I hate you, she said, tears streaming down her face. I hate both of you. Good, I replied. Now you know how it feels. She turned and ran from the restaurant, leaving me standing with Maggie among the wreckage of her carefully constructed lies. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of applause from a table near the window. It started slowly, just one person clapping, then spread throughout the restaurant until the entire dining room was applauding. I looked around at the faces of my neighbors and community members, seeing approval and support where I'd expected judgment and embarrassment. These were good people who understood the difference between right and wrong, and they just witnessed justice being served. Feel better? Maggie asked. Getting there, I replied. How about you? Ask me again in a few months, but this was a good start. We sat back down and finished our dinner, talking about practical matters like divorce proceedings and custody arrangements. The conversation was surprisingly pleasant, given the circumstances, and I found myself thinking that maybe there was life after Sophie's betrayal. As we were leaving the restaurant, Maggie touched my arm gently. Thank you for reaching out to me. I don't know how long I would have lived in denial if you hadn't forced the truth into the open. Thank you for having the courage to face it with me. Sophie and Eric thought they were so clever, but they never counted on their victims fighting back. Speaking of fighting back, Maggie said with a smile that was both sweet and dangerous, I think Eric's going to be very surprised when he gets home tonight. I've already changed the locks and packed his belongings. Where's he going to go? That's not my problem anymore. Maybe he can stay with Sophie. They can comfort each other while they figure out how to rebuild their lives from scratch. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. I like the way you think, Maggie Morrison. It's going to be Maggie Peterson again soon, she replied. I'm taking back my maiden name. As we walked to our cars, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Sophie's betrayal had nearly destroyed me, but it had also led me to discover my own strength and to find an ally in the most unexpected place. The real Sophie had finally been revealed, and she was exactly as ugly as her actions had suggested. But I was free of her now, and that freedom was worth everything I'd lost.